what I want to do today is not only talk about sound and art, but from the viewpoint of a sense of irreverence and how people think about creativity and design with digital media. So first up, the Met in the US essentially has over 20 million objects under its control in their archive, has about 19 different curatorial departments, and occupies several million square feet of Central Park. So it's one of the largest museums in the US. The fun part about the Met and thinking of the idea of remixing a museum is essentially that architecture, and if you think about the archive, the Met is kind of one of these places that has an iconic relationship to New York. So the idea was to apply DJ technique to how people thought of an archive. So the idea was to go through the museum, look at the objects, and generate compositions. So whenever I do a kind of residency or art project, half the battle is research. One of the things I found with the Met was that it was radically overwhelming because there was a tremendous amount of objects. So being able to take over a museum and be able to remix it implies a couple things. One, the idea of architecture, and two, the idea of the instability of a composition. I'll give you an example. One of my favorite composers, Mussorgsky, is a Russian composer who has a piece called Portraits at an Exhibition. And that's considered to be one of the first compositions to think about moving through a museum. So you have a sense of procession, you have a sense of being able to engage an archive, and above all, you have a sense of how the dynamic engagement with art generates music. So later composers like Scriabin, or for that matter, John Cage, all approach the idea of looking at architecture and design from the viewpoint of patterns. John Cage is usually considered to be the first person to write compositions for turntables. So in 1939, he wrote a piece called Imaginary Landscape. So with the Met, what I did was say, okay, if you guys have 19 curatorial divisions, something like over 20 million objects, let's think about this as the idea of the museum. Because there's no way I could actually generate compositions unless I set up an algorithm to go through the entire archive and then make it just become a huge abstraction, which some people would do. So with that said and done, what I ended up doing was breaking the residency into 5 sections, each section dealing with certain thematics. So one was about environmental issues, the other was about sort of economics, the other was about sort of historical archival materials that overall, kind of reflected some of this stuff, and then so on and so on. One of the last ones was called Of Water and Ice, and I ended up doing that as an open source project, because the idea is no one owns water, no one owns ice. And amusing enough, museums are about pulling things out of circulation in a culture. They're about creating a dead space, essentially where you look at an object that's divorced from its context. So what I wanted to do was look at water and ice as sort of metaphors for how we can really think about instability of an object. There's a very famous phrase from the poet Schiller, who simply says, "Architecture is nothing but frozen music." So if we remix that phrase and do a little bit of wordplay, we can say music is nothing but liquid architecture. So what I ended up doing was going through a project where I took a studio to Antarctica. It's a very cold day. And the fun part about going to Antarctica was, A, there was no people. There's only about 2,000 people on the entire continent, and they're all scientists. But the situation for me was looking at scale, and people really couldn't get how big these objects were. So I started thinking more and more about how people would respond to landscape. So part of that project as a composition was to do research, and we eventually had the concert at the Met. And when you walked into the room, I had hundreds of screens playing different kinds of ice. And the fun part about that is that ice is a very geometric form. And so you can get to kind of an algorithmic process. And eventually, that became a batch of compositions and a book. And then I played the book at the Met. So this is already getting more and more interdisciplinary. People couldn't get a sense of scale until they saw other people. And then you realize how big this place is, and how a composition reflecting that would have to generate something looking at patterns overall, because the idea here of a landscape and a composition being presented in a museum is what was the goal. So I started doing more research, and this is what they call ice core sampling. So in Antarctica, they dig down into the ice and essentially are able to tell what was in the air 10 million years ago, 5 million years ago, and so on. So it's like sampling a record. And as you dig down into the layers of sediment, you can easily see striation And actually, you can think of the Earth itself as an archaeological record. So what happens if you play the ice? One of my favorite theoreticians of this is a gentleman by the name of Johannes Kepler. In 1611, he was on his way home, and a snowflake landed on his sleeve, and he was stunned by the geometry of the ice. And he went home and wrote this very famous essay called 6 Sides of a Snowflake. And it's one of the first rigorous mathematical treatises looking at science applied to nature in the form of geometry and math. So, interestingly enough, those equations go straight into digital media, and I was able to look at it from the viewpoint of an algorithmic process, and did research more and more about the geometry of ice. And you can easily see an algorithmic process at work, and a kind of fractal layering going on. And the stunning beauty of nature is that it's about patterns at every level. So if you go from the macro level to the micro, you can easily see how scientists have been exploring this. But as a composer, I was really interested in this idea of pattern recognition as a basic compositional tool. For this project, going to the Met, that it ended up being called Of Water and Ice. So here's me sampling a string quartet through my iPad software and being able to take all of the motifs and elements that the musicians are playing and then generating beats and elements from that. Act of sampling as a détournement, a pulling apart of the idea of these sort of revered composers and pulling them apart into a kind of world of hip-hop and techno and dubstep and so on. When you think about perspective, which I always like trying to put yourself in the other person's shoes, sampling says, let's pull apart the perspective that you are listening to a found sound, that you are listening to something that is a culturally received and culturally conditioned context. So you have an uneasy tension between context and content. So I always use this as a funny example of when people perceive the other from a different point of view. So if we remix these two, you can easily kind of start thinking of, I'll just show you a kind of amusing remix. It's a remix of Bush and Obama. And the idea here is that you have a visual collage. This is kind of the Photoshop imagination. And the eerie thing about the way sampling and the seamlessness of a collage at this point in digital media is that editing itself is an art form. So when you start thinking about what that means in a geopolitical context, what it means is essentially that data itself is now the new palette. Basically, all of the stuff I'm showing you guys is free. I'm a very big fan of this idea of open source culture. And I developed this. There's the generic version, which is just called DJ Mixer, and then this is the more customized version. So it's on the iTunes store, and so is my books and so on. But I was thinking about graphic design and record cover sleeves, and the idea of the interface. So you can take your record crates, tap, and you have this idea of post playlist, and be able to pull in all the bits and pieces of various parts of your record collection and assign it to turntables. So I'll just... James Brown! 1, 2, 3, So now, if you think of your record collection and the idea of a passive consumer experience, the idea of collage and the idea of the record cover sleeve is quite interesting because you're tying sound to memory. Now, my most recent books are with MIT Press. The last book was called Sound Unbound. Sound Unbound, I had about 30 different essays by 30 different theoreticians talking about sound art and digital media. So what I ended up doing was getting people like Pierre Boulez, Brian Eno, Steve Reich. Out of all of this, one of the favorite people that I tracked down was the guy who invented the record cover sleeve. So Alex Steinweiss, so whenever you go into a record store, you're essentially being bombarded with visual material that is encoded with sound and sound memory. So if you think about some of the earlier record cover sleeves that he designed, the graphic design is very much a crucial component of getting people to think about what the sound looks like. So he went into RCA Victor one day and said, why don't we put an image on the record cover sleeve? And amusing enough, in the history of graphic design, record cover sleeves used to be blank. So that created a huge revolution in graphic design that lingers with us to this day. And if you just click back, you can easily see it becomes apps. So when you start thinking about what is an app, you're essentially looking at something that is about a tactile creative space where you're touching and interacting with data. Now, a record is usually considered to be something that's a document. But with these kind of materials, you're looking at more and more moving into a 21st century relationship to data aesthetics. If you start thinking about what is a turntable and a permutation machine, you're able to easily play elements, collage, loop, layer, and sample. So that's a practice of discourse. It's not just about sound. It's about the way sound changes. The pun here is that you're looking at dematerialization, you're looking at digital media, but you're also looking at a composer using research to dig into what we think about with data aesthetics. Now, I want to show you another project that I think might be resonant with you guys, which is a film I just did the score to called Downloaded. It's narrated by Sean Parker and Sean Fanning, these two gentlemen here. Sean Fanning, the gentleman on the right, started what we call Napster, and Sean Parker on the left was one of the co-founders of what we call Facebook. The key figures of the last 10 years social media movement to think about sound and the internet. And so for me as an artist, these are people who I think are very influential, but they're also intriguing figures to sample. So I composed the score for this film based on everyone's narrative, then remixed it and edited it together to have a continuous kind of mixtape feel. As a composer and artist, these are things that reflect directly on this idea that the network system of the web is part of my compositional archive. How I think about sampling and sounds is the connectivity of it all. So let me just show you one other example, then I'm going to get into the Vanuatu project. What we ended up doing was worked with the Sci-Fi Channel in the US and did a series of vignettes about climate change. And we eventually had it on mainstream TV. So kids would be watching stuff like Battlestar Galactica or, you know, crazy science fiction TV shows, and then all of a sudden these TV commercials would come up with like melting polar caps and like, you know, penguins breakdancing in the middle of Manhattan and stuff like that. So actually it was quite popular as these kind of vignettes showing the context of climate change, but in a medium that people could get it. But you have to be able to reach people where they are. So you can't tell them where they should go, you should deal with them where they are. So much of my work has gone through the process of trying to understand pop culture and remix it and sample it to what I view as messages that I can convey through a literary context. So those are certain projects that have all unfolded in museums, in galleries, on TV, on the web, and above all, they explore the idea that the studio is the world. As an artist, these things interest me, and I like the idea of disruption, of the glitch, of imperfection, what the Japanese would call wabi-sabi. Now, amusing enough, some of the other projects I'm doing that relate to islands go straight to this idea of colonial networks. So I'm going to just show you quickly the Nauru project. This is the world's smallest republic, so it's sort of anti-utopia. Now, the term utopos means place of nowhere, and it was an island that was a metaphor for the idea of perfectibility of society. Now, Nauru, on the other hand, is a very dystopian, very heavy-handed place that's been mined by the Australians to the point that it's a devastated moonscape. So the idea was to do compositions reflecting this environmental catastrophe. And let me just show you what it ended up looking like. Everything on the island's rusted and falling apart. There's these huge ruins of the Nauru Phosphate Corporation. This is a massive structure that the Australians were using to extract resources and materials. That the place had been occupied by the Japanese during World War II as well, and this is Japanese bunkers. And then the Americans came through and bombed everything, and you can see that everything even melted into the ground. So this is, pillbox bunkers, ruins. Yeah, that's the ruins of the presidential palace. So it's a place that's kind of, they have an epidemic of obesity at the moment. Massive corruption and a collapse of the nation state's governance policies. Eerily enough, this is a really intriguing reflection of the ruins of empire, the confetti of these fragmented collapses of not only the Soviet Union, but the British Empire, the Japanese Empire, Australian corporate depredation. So looking at all the metaphors, and of course, ecological collapse, the island is also sinking, So these are pretty good metaphors for our current moment. This project is still touring. It's a group of string quartet works that I wrote called the Nauru Elegies, and it's metaphorical, but also very, related to the materiality of ecological devastation. And I'll just show you what it looks like. The Economist magazine, a whole bunch of other magazines have been looking at Vanuatu as the happiest place on earth because the variables that go into the happiness index were based on what they call intangible goods, the idea of quality of life. And what I was doing when Vanuatu was looking at percussion instruments. These are what they call talking drums, so sort of original techno. And these drums, they play in very large scale rituals. So I took scans of the drums and started making these kinds of percussion surfaces. And these are large, actually. These are all projects that still deal with patterns, and I'm going to kind of keep riffing on this idea of pattern recognition. But from hip-hop to techno to dubstep to reggae, you name it, we live in an era where rhythms, as we think of them as electronic, determine culture. And whether it be global finance or whether it be a hip-hop beat, the idea of pattern recognition is what holds together modern culture. So as an artist, I'm very interested in collage as a way of breaking down the barriers between the industrial versus post-industrial versus pre-industrial. Because if you really think about it, the idea of the human spirit in the 20th century was about industrialization and people getting standardized life and standardized lifestyle. And for the 21st century, we're now in the era of mass customization, where everyone will have access to material to generate their own take on it. So I think my art reflects that in a way that sampling is saying, this is the new archive, this is the new palette. And we need to start thinking about getting out of the 20th century mentality of industrialization and standardization. And I think that that's something that's probably one of the healthiest things human society can start thinking about, because otherwise we're all going to be like China with massive pollution and everyone, just totally grinding. And in Vanuatu, we're hoping to set up a kind of nonprofit based on sustainable design. And these are some of the first people I'm inviting out. They're called the Brooklyn Bamboo Collective. And they use bamboo, which is actually quite carbon negative, to create installations and so on. So, for example, we want to do a lab session where people learn how to make their own bicycles. And intriguing enough, bamboo is stronger than steel, and you can eat it. So if you've ever had bamboo salad, you're on your carbon negative part, And intriguing enough, if you cut down bamboo, it grows back within a season, but if you cut down wood, it takes hundreds of years to grow back. So during that process, it's pulling a lot of carbon out of the air. So what we're going to be doing here, COFA probably next year during my residency, we'll be exploring sustainable practices in the arts and thinking about sampling between mediums. So imagine stuff like a solar-powered sound system or a bamboo bicycle and the design components that go into that. The idea will be to set up a design lab on this remote place and start thinking about different kinds of creative approaches to interdisciplinary sampling. So it's a lab, it's a studio, and it's about, above all, saying that the discussion between mediums is where I think some of the newer and more robust ideas about contemporary society will be coming out of. So that's the idea of an island.
When you build anything, architecture fundamentally is dealing with tension and compression. And the outer limits of that spectrum of forces are stone and bamboo, because bamboo actually just naturally deals with tension. But what fascinates me about bamboo, and I think it's getting around to what I wanted, the comment that I wanted you to perhaps speak to, was that it's a material that actually tells you what to do. You get it, you chop it, and you go, oh, I get it. So a hollow, round cylinder is almost as strong as a solid one. Then you cut it again, it's a container, oh, it's a glass. So that immediate response, I sort of thought there's a direct analogy between that as a material, I think, and the apps that you use. There's something about, we've finally reached a point in technology where I would say that the apps are, in fact, the new bamboo. So it's quite logical to me that you and bamboo sort of go together, but don't forget the apps, because I think they're going to produce, we're at a point where there's going to be a massive acceleration as a result. And the deftness with which you're guiding us into that territory.
I mean, the thing about sampling is that it's pulling apart things that you're familiar with. So if you hear a James Brown song, or if you hear a Rolling Stones song, or whatever, familiar, so that's where you get this uncanny effect, where it's essentially your memory is being messed with. But the interesting thing about what you're saying is building code actually holds back so much of how we think of what could be happening with architecture, because the standardization and the way that, say for example, in Australia, you guys use a lot of brick. And that's actually not responsive to the environment here. And in fact, you have to have more electricity and more things that are not renewable to just keep it cool or to heat it or whatever. Whereas the indigenous people before, the Aboriginals maybe would have built different kinds of architecture in-house. So what I want to do with the Vanuatu project is show that you can have different dialectical processes, something where why not put people who are super high-tech in the middle of a remote area and see what happens? Or for that matter, have them in dialogue. One of Vanuatu's major traditions, I'll just show you really quick, is what they call sand painting. They draw these stunningly beautiful patterns in the sand and then blow it away. It's meant to be this impermanence. And interesting enough, every point and intersection on this is a story. So the guy's telling you a story while he's drawing in the sand, and the story is a mnemonic, like he's memorized the history of the people or the region. So with architecture, it's about permanence. I think the West usually goes for monumentalism and this idea of using those building materials to represent whether it be a Roman Empire or American, skyscraper, etc. But many other cultures have looked at impermanence, and I kind of love stuff like that.
I want to ask you about it's odd. I mean, I just spent 10 years writing a book about sound and ecology, or it comes into sound ecology and media. But I was not out. I was like in libraries and not surfing. But we've ended up in the same place, and I want to ask you, how did you start off in sound? Because that's sort of what it was called, among other things, and end up in ecology right now.
It's.
I mean, is there something inherent, in what you were doing in the early '90s that somehow there's some germ within that ends up in ecology?
I'm a big fan of when you're thinking about sampling, you have to really go for this like building blocks of memory. So if I take a beat or if I take a bass line or a horn riff, it has to work seamlessly. Or you can play with the glitch, make it break in a way that's interesting. But on the other hand, with the imagination, I like to say the imagination is the ultimate renewable resource. And people are recycling and reusing memory and being able to create new experiences. There was a moment in culture where people were using devices, computers and machines and so on, in unintended ways. So if you were going to take an electronic sound, it wasn't expected that you would make beats and all of a sudden start a party or something. It was more like, also the same thing with record players. Like Thomas Edison never felt that, he was like, why would anyone ever want to play back a sound? In fact, records were meant to be recorders. So there's always these accidental uses of materials, or unexpected. So for me as an artist, in the 90s, I was never planning on doing music. I did my first gallery shows with Jeffrey Deitch and with Nina Nozay, and was planning on going straight into the sound art kind of scene. And there's people like Christian Marclay, et cetera. But I didn't like, the art world can't deal with beats. I don't know what it is. They just really, it has to be like squeaky noises. And so, the art world was very resistant to beats. They just, they just couldn't deal with it. So for me, it was more fun and more renewing to do more social events and stuff like that. So when I did 2 degrees, one in philosophy, the other in French literature. And when I graduated from Bowdoin College in Maine, it's the little Ivies. We have Bowdoin, Bates, Oberlin, Wesleyan, Haverford, Swarthmore, stuff like that. When I graduated, I was writing for Art Forum and the Village Voice, doing music criticism and art criticism. But you couldn't pay the bills. New York's very expensive. So I started throwing rent parties while I was working on my art. And those rent parties became really popular. Those events became happenings in the same way that I was looking at John Cage or Robert Rauschenberg. And that's where I felt that there was a really good linkage between how people thought about social process and people like Nam June Paik and projection and lighting and stuff like that, like parties and events. And environmental stuff had been a component of my work for many years because it was sound of the city. The city is not, many people separate the city from ecological issues, but to me that's a very big mistake because we have to think of the city as a seamless engagement with the ecosystems that surround it. So music and hip hop and pattern recognition and all that kind of stuff was meant to be very much about the core of the city. But amusing enough, over the course of years, I was like, everyone's experiences are getting more and more and more standardized by the urban dynamic. So I wanted to pose an experiment to myself to see what would happen if I took a studio out of my familiar terrain of the city. And I'm DJing all over the world for the last 15 plus years, going to places like Tokyo, Berlin, Beijing, Mumbai, Sydney, you name it, for the last several years. And the thing you keep noticing is that there's more and more and more standardization of rhythm, house music, techno, dubstep, you name it. So I wanted to pose a question to myself: if this is the new environment, the information environment, what's the most remote part of that? And that's where I decided to go to Antarctica. And a year and a half ago, I went to the North Pole, and then going to Vanuatu and Nauru as some of the most remote places to see, what would happen.
The actual the application system is irresistible with its big bank of information. You just illustrated that through your talk and your own bank of information. But the app for DJ Spooky in particular, this sort of leading from hip-hop, this sort of two wheels, this irresistible spin against, I'm just fascinated by, that to me is the bamboo. Why is this so irresistible as a mechanism? The beat, the double, it's very specific. It's two, I want to get back to this mechanism and understand it better and why it's grown through culture, but now it could actually make architecture. That's the fascination for me, or change language, because it's so accelerated by its memory bank.
Mm-hmm.
But it's two circles, it's spinning against each other. What have you really thought about it as, I'm sure you have, as an instrument?
Oh, yeah.
Why is it so irresistible, and why is it able to tell you what to do? Even me, old rocker, can, I'm sure, open that app and start going,
Yeah.
Like it's kind of, can we talk about the mechanism? Is that
sure? Well, the turntable, the turntable is kind of a playback device, but for me, it's more of a permutation device. So you want to change things up. You want to try different approaches, because if everybody has the same record, it's boring, So you want to make your own mix and your own version. Now, on the other end of the spectrum, apps, you got to remember the iPad only came out, it came out April 10, 2010, and it's only been 3 years. It radically changed people's relationships to the surface of the screen. So mobile media is now the dominant vocabulary. Everyone has a smartphone. Most people have access to reasonable data rates and so on. Even if you're in the most remote parts of Afghanistan or Antarctica, you more than likely will have access to mobile media in some capacity. So as a DJ, that meant that essentially everyone has access to this archive of records and downloadable files. So you have to imagine 5 years from now, tablet computers, wearable computers, Google Glass, the interface of the body, how we orient ourselves with GPS and so on. That is very much, I think, the path we're on. But with nature, this is where something probably Jill's been talking about with the Anthropocene era. We're projecting all of our internal things out into these networks that influence and or destroy nature. But if we're destroying it and we're part of nature, is that meaning that nature itself is a destructive force in its own right? Which one could argue every major environmental change has been a massive catastrophe. So these are issues I'm using as provocation. Is sound itself an environment? And if so, what about noise? What about noise pollution? What about the idea that the heartbeat and the brain itself, we're making our own rhythms and patterns and so on. So these are meta questions, but they also, I think, reach to the core of what it means to be a digital citizen, because we're participating in an information economy. And it's so important that I think we have to think about literacy right now, like digital literacy.
That's what's fascinating. You're actually now able to sort of riff on this machine and actually build architecture.
Yeah.
And then have it modeled. It's it's manufactured from sound. So you literally, as an architect, you could be just at your desk designing and documenting with music.
Buildings that will be changeable. I really think we're going to have to start thinking about multifunctionality, repurposing, remixing, all of that kind of stuff is now going to be part of the vernacular of how people think of the buildings we occupy. because, yeah.
I mean, Sumi's a really good student of constant, the situationist, and in the end, it's seemingly working back towards perhaps building the vision of unitary urbanism, where there's fluid program within this organism of building. That's what you're talking about.
Yeah, I mean, architecture, that's why I kept saying that phrase, architecture. When people say architecture is nothing but frozen music, let's play with that meaning and let's pull it apart and sample and remix it and say music is liquid architecture. It's irreverent. It's something that can change on a dime. It can really go in different directions very quickly. And that's where I think the role of the composer, the role of the architect have come together.
If these ice cores are the archive, Earth archive, and all that's melting, and those, is there like a contemporary equivalent for is this archive that we're building up on the internet and all this recording, is that ever going to melt, or is that is it prone? Yeah, is it prone to some type of life expectancy? Or?
Any system will crash. Any system. There's artists who are focusing on viruses and stuff like that, which always makes me a little wary. And hackers. I mean, of course, I'm sure many of you know about Snowden, the Snowden incident with the NSA and surveillance, and Julian Assange, of course. But I'm surprised that we haven't had more. So yeah, if you're talking about digging into the earth and finding the layers of civilization, like you're saying, that soot, what happens when we start digging into the roots of information? And I think that's where you're going to be seeing a lot of artists looking at the next 5 years of data. There have been people like Tim Berners-Lee, who's considered to be the inventor of the web. They can't even find his first web page because they didn't think anybody would want it. This summer I visited CERN, which is this huge particle collider where they needed better ways of organizing information and made the web. But Tim Berners-Lee, they didn't think anybody would want it. And so all the first web pages are gone. And that's, like, I have software that won't even talk to software that I used 2 years ago. And then software from 2 years ago won't even talk to software that I was using 5 years ago. So, you have to start thinking about archaeology of the present.